with a heavy heart, but a great privilege to be able to stand in this chamber to offer some reflections on the phenomenal life of the late Senator Linda White. Certainly news of her passing was devastating for everyone who knew her, and I think we can see through all of the speeches made both in the Senate and in the House today that she had a large life that impacted tens of thousands of people. And I know that her passing was devastating news to everyone who had the extraordinary privilege to have known, worked with, loved and embraced Linda White. That was especially so for those of us in the Labor family, of course. You don't get to, well, you could not ask for a better comrade by your side. And Linda was incredibly smart, she was witty, she was passionate, she was determined, and really a fearless warrior for justice. And I'll come back to that a little later. She was dedicated absolutely to improving the lives of Australian workers. We knew that from her entire working life. She articulated that in her first speech. It's what she practiced in her daily life. She was pivotal to so many critical battles and reforms in this country, and I know many of them have been so beautifully articulated by the speakers on this condolence motion. We've heard much about her time as a very young woman working for McDonald's, and while she didn't win that fight at the time, it really did prove to her the power of collectivism and what that can achieve, and that sense of love and respect for collective action is something that that really drove her throughout her life, and it's something that for those of us who have been in the Labor movement for a long time also share and appreciate. It's a common thread for those of us that sit in the Labor benches, of course, is that acute understanding of just how powerful collectivism can be when you are able to move yourself above and beyond the individual and think about the collective good and the power of collective action. In 2012, Linda, while she was the National Secretary of the Australian Services Union, Linda led the phenomenal campaign for equal pay for more than 200,000 non-government social and community service workers across Australia. A number of my colleagues have pointed to this moment and to this really extraordinary campaign that was so successful, often known and referred to as the Sachs Award. It was, you cannot overstate the significance of that moment for a group of people, well, mostly women, let's face it, a group of women who were mostly ignored in Australia in industrial relations disputes, in conversations in this parliament. These were women who were low paid, on the fringes, doing incredibly valuable work, but mostly unseen, mostly unheard. And Linda, who was always good at being able to think big, really drove that most critical of campaigns, very successful campaign for equal pay. I remember Linda prosecuting this argument at Labor conferences year after year, building the case, and of course, her work with the Australian Services Union really enabled us to break through that those terrible barriers that had been in place for those women who, as I said, were mostly ignored, were without power, and seldom had their voices heard. So that was, of course, the antithesis of what Linda White ever wanted to see. So it should be of no surprise to those of us who knew Linda that she would want to take on this big battle, and she did. It was a relentless campaign over 6 years, and it changed the equal pay laws in our nation. And a long and detailed Fair Work Commission case was put to ultimately win those pay rises of between 27 and 43%, plus safety net increases that got delivered over 8 years. That's what I mean about Linda White being able to think big. She was not really content about just tinkering around the edges. She was absolutely prepared to... she was patient. She didn't suffer fools, but she was patient, and she knew the work that had to be done in order to win that case. And if it was going to take 6 years, 8 years, she was up to that task. And we should all be very, very indebted for that. Because that case, as I said, I mean, you really cannot understate the transformational nature of that case, which changed the lives of women workers in the community sector forever. And some extremely underpaid people saw increases of some $700 a week in their pay, which was, I think, even the most optimistic of us at the time would have thought that was probably that was almost an unimaginable outcome, and yet it was indeed a tremendous victory. Linda taught us that if you are a successful woman, you absolutely have a duty, a profound obligation indeed, to bring other women along with you. And it's a great lesson to learn. It's one that I take very much to heart, and she took that responsibility very seriously and fulfilled that ambition with, great distinction. I note the member for Jagga Jagga, I was in the chamber when she was speaking earlier, and acknowledged how there are indeed many of us Labor women who would want to thank Linda for her long-standing service and her doggedness to ensure that our party changed affirmative action rules. And so she, like many of us, was so proud to serve in Australia's first majority female government. And it's a little known fact, actually, in this nation. But we can say thanks to Linda. She would be the first to acknowledge all the women that came before her in that fight too. And I'm going to come back to just how important her role was on both the national executive of the ALP and the role she took in driving Labor's affirmative action commitments over a long period of time. With her own election into the Senate in 2022, she became part of, as I said, Australia's very first majority women government elected. And it was very fitting that the woman who drove that change for us as a party over many decades was now part of that female majority government. I will come back to some of her great work having as a senator, but I do want to just touch on two aspects of Linda's work that I got to work with her in close partnership and had some really wonderful insights into both the Linda's capacity to make profound change. One of those was actually on the floor of a national conference for the Australian Labor Party back in 2015. I hadn't had a lot to do with Linda White at that point. I'd seen her, as I said, on the floor of conferences. We were both regular attendees at our respective state and territory branches, but at the national conference. And, she was in Victoria, I was in New South Wales, so we belonged to different branches of the party, and it was a national conference where we would really get to connect. I had a profound interest in making sure that Labor was going to accelerate its commitments to affirmative action as quickly as we could. And this is something that Linda and I spoke often about. And I just recall at this conference, it was the one where we finally got the ruling changed to ensure 50-50 female representation in the party, in all our power structures within the party, as well as the pre-selection for winnable seats. This was a big moment for the Australian Labor Party. And, for those who'd been around this debate for a few decades leading up to this moment, it was also, you need to understand that there's a little bit of frustration about not moving more quickly. And it was, I will never forget, without giving away too many kind of secrets here, I absolutely salute Linda White at this moment, where we had been bogged down in some very difficult negotiations. You can imagine across all the states and territories and all the different component parts of the Australian Labor Party. And it was very uncertain as to whether we could land this 50-50 target at this conference or not. I mean, it seems extraordinary now in 2024 to be saying that, but, there was a very, very live issue, and it was pretty tense, and we were in negotiations morning, then back again, and morning tea again at lunch, and it was going on, and it was, I remember just walking out feeling a little bit dispirited, actually, and wondering whether we would pull this off this time or not. And I walked out with Linda, and she just looked at me, and I won't repeat everything that was said at that moment, but it was basically, enough. We're going in there, it's 50-50 or nothing, and we're going hard. And it's like, whoa, okay. And it was like music to my ears to begin with, but she had that ability to not only, was she intelligent and brilliant at negotiating herself, but empower those around her to have the strength to go in alongside her and have many of those difficult conversations that had to be had about, why the importance of gender equality in our world. So I take that moment, I have held that moment with me in many, many subsequent negotiations and efforts, I guess, to ensure that our party adheres to its affirmative action principles. And as I say, it's not just about winning, having women in winnable seats so that they get elected into Parliament, but it's also about ensuring that the very power structures within our party are alive to the significance of gender equality and the role that women play. So, like the member for Jagga, and indeed many of us, we are deeply indebted for those that come behind and get to benefit from the work of Linda White and all of those extraordinary women who came before us to ensure that we could get a resolution up at the 2015 National Conference that established targets for positions within the party and within union delegations, which was another important skill and some authenticity that Linda was able to bring to the table in encouraging union delegations to ensure that they had targets for women, and empowered the party's national executive then to intervene when state branches or territory branches didn't adhere to the rules, where they didn't pre-select or hit their 50% target on pre-selection. So for Linda, you know, making those rule changes was really important, and it ensured that it wasn't just hollow words at a conference when we got up to speak at the lectern or indeed standing in Parliament, that you did the hard yards, ensured that, you know, we had real rules and regulations with sanctions if they did not, if they were not met. That was the work of Linda White, who moved that motion in the 2015 National Conference, and it was Linda White that gave all of us the strength and courage to stand up and say enough. Enough is enough. So, Linda, your legacy in that regard will just live for many, many decades to come, and we are really deeply indebted to you. The second piece of work that I got to do with Linda White was here in this place. So again, I'm going to refer to party business, but I was asked by the Prime Minister to head up a working group to revisit the Labor Party's policies around sexual harassment, bullying and harassment. And I was very, very fortunate to have on this working group some remarkable people, but you won't be surprised to hear that the National Executive Representative was Senator Linda White, who I couldn't have been, you know, more pleased with being able to get to work with Linda on the next stage of our work together about ensuring not only do we have gender equity within our party, that our party would be a safe and respectful place for women to participate at every level. So it was a very big body of work. It took a couple of years. For those that may not have a deep appreciation of the way that political parties operate. The Australian Labor Party is a federated party, a bit like this Parliament. And federation means you've got to do a lot of negotiation across a lot of states and territory branches. And I've got to say, there were a lot of people who doubted this was even possible. Linda, of course, was one of those women you need by your side at that moment, because she utterly believed in this project, that we could not be, you know, no legitimate political party in 2023 at the time it was, could proceed without having, you know, codes of conduct and rules in place that were fit for purpose, ensuring that our party was indeed leading, if not, you know, in efforts to ensure best practice. So there were 4 documents created, and I cannot tell you how proud she was to again, you know, when everyone suggested that it was going to be an impossible task, Linda's drive and determination and her reminding me constantly about this is our window of opportunity. This is our moment to get this done. And so it is, you know, that really helped sustain myself and indeed many others on the committee to ensure that we didn't waste our time, we didn't waste our duty to ensure that this body of work was completed. And Linda felt that as strongly as I did, and it was, you know, whilst I got to chair and often speak and do a lot of the front-leaning work, I could not have done it without Linda White. You know, her knowledge of national executive operations and the way that all of the state and territory branches operate, you know, she was critical in, always sustaining me and others on the committee to do the hard conversations, the hard talks that had to take place. But, it comes of no surprise. She is somebody who had all her life championed safe, inclusive, respectful workplaces, and she proactively sought to prevent discrimination, sexual harassment and bullying wherever it lived. So of course she was going to be someone in the front lines of making sure that we clean our own house up as a party before ensuring that we do so on the national stage in legislation that will come before our respective houses here. Linda, through her work with the ASU, was instrumental in the the campaign around the paid family domestic violence leave. It was wonderful that was legislation that got passed while she was here in the Senate. Likewise, she understood well it wasn't just a gender pay gap that we had to tackle in Australia, but there was a super gap as well, and a big one, and one that was growing. And she said in her first speech, superannuation is yet another area where women get a raw deal. And my God, she was so on the money again. Of course, she was right. The gap between the retirement savings of women and men is greater than the gender pay gap. We know it's at least 25% difference in those balances now. She campaigned fearlessly for reform while she was with the ASU, and she would have been so gratified to see Labor announce superannuation on paid parental leave, which occurred sadly just days after her passing. I think that in spite of all of Linda's achievements, and I have only just touched on a few and ones that were very meaningful to me, despite all of those achievements, we know Linda just would have had a list as long as could be of all the things she still wanted to do. She loved to contribute. She was a solid worker and one that never lost sight of that big picture. And my thoughts are really especially with Linda's beloved brother, Michael now, her extended family, her staff who spoke so highly of her, who admired her so deeply. She spoke so highly of them and they admired her so deeply in return. And I don't underestimate the challenge that it is for all of her staff now who are they are hurt, they are grieving. I really want to acknowledge Ben Armstrong, who has had to bear a lot in these last few weeks, and of course the remainder of Linda's staff, Hector, Ned, Eid, and Amit, and all of her comrades who worked by her side, whether it was at the Australian Services Union or with the very broad Labor Party she played a role in for so many decades. We have lost a good human in Linda White, and our hearts are heavy, but we are forever grateful for her selfless service, for her leadership, for her big thinking, for her courage. And there is no doubt that we are all very much richer for having had Linda in our lives. Vale, Linda White, you will be missed.